Next item of business is debate on motion 19061 in the name of Derek Mackay on the Scottish National Investment Bank Bill. May I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Derek Mackay to speak to and move the motion for up to 12 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, it is with great pleasure that I open this Stage 1 debate on the Scottish National Investment Bank Bill. The bill being considered today lays the foundation for an institution that will be a cornerstone in Scotland's economic architecture, one with the capability and commitment to reshape our economy, making it more inclusive, more innovative and more internationally competitive. As a mission-oriented lender, the bank will continue and contribute to the major societal challenges facing us all today. In particular, as the First Minister has set out, the bank will make a significant contribution to work to tackle the climate emergency. And I'll come on to that later in more detail. We want this bank to be a valuable asset in the Scottish economy for generations to come. And for that to be the case, the bank will have to protect and grow its portfolio of investments, recycling one decade of success into the next. The bank will therefore make investments that support sustainable and inclusive growth across Scotland and will be held to account for its delivery against the missions set for it. It will also seek to make a sufficient return on its investments so that it can cover its operating costs and not be reliant for the long term on the Scottish Government and therefore the Scottish taxpayer. In 2017, the First Minister asked Benny Higgins to provide a blueprint for the Government on how to establish an institution capable of transforming Scotland's economy. The implementation plan he produced articulates a clear, ambitious vision for the bank and provides a detailed roadmap for creating an institution that can deliver against that vision. And I would like to personally thank Benny and his team for their ambition and rigour in producing the implementation plan. Our proposals for the bank have also been strengthened by extensive stakeholder and public engagement. And we've run 2 public consultations in the last few years, and more than 300 people attended a series of 8 stakeholder events held across Scotland over the summer. Throughout that engagement, I've been struck by the level of excitement about our vision for the bank and its potential to transform Scotland's economy. And I wish to thank those who engaged with us in creating this bill and helping to lay the foundation for a bank that will deliver for businesses and communities across Scotland. We will continue to engage widely as we work to establish the bank as it progresses. I'd also like to thank the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for their very thoughtful and constructive scrutiny of the bill. The committee recommends that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the bill. That's a relief, Presiding Officer. But I've made a number of very helpful suggestions as well. In recognising that the bank must be independent but accountable and permanent but adaptable, the committee demonstrates a clear appreciation for the type of institution that we collectively wish to create. Presiding Officer, the Scottish economy is one that enjoys significant strengths, whether it's around employment or the proportion of employees in the UK paid the living wage, and growing demand for our exports all demonstrate our economic resilience. But it is important to acknowledge that there remains significant work to do to release the untapped potential of Scotland's economy. The 2019-20 programme for government sets out ambitious and progressive sets of proposals. These measures include increased investment in skills and physical and digital infrastructure. These measures can improve productivity, boost exports and help make Scotland a globally competitive place to do business. Business investment levels are low and their potential for growth has been curbed. Scotland's business expenditure on research and development and innovation performance is behind that of other European nations. Our productivity growth in key sectors, whilst outperforming the UK, also remains modest. But these factors point to the need for a new investor in the Scottish economy, one with patience and the strategic oversight to reinforce and enhance Scotland's position as a dynamic and innovative economy. The case for establishing the bank is even stronger today than it was when it was first announced in our 2017 programme for government. Patient and strategic investment will be vital if we are to mitigate some of the damaging impacts which are forecast as a result of the UK exiting the EU. So, Presiding Officer, earlier this year, the First Minister acknowledged that Scotland, like the rest of the world, faces a climate emergency. This year's programme for government set out our response and lays the foundations for a new Scottish Green Deal. So the Scottish National Investment Bank will also have a role to play, and the First Minister has confirmed that the bank's primary mission will be securing the transition to a net zero economy. It is vital that the bank is an institution which complements the existing investment landscape here in Scotland, one that crowds in rather than crowds out private sector investors. So we believe that capitalising the bank to the tune of £2 billion represents an ambitious yet achievable level of funding. It enables the bank to have a transformative impact on the Scottish economy whilst ensuring, absolutely in just a moment, that it doesn't displace the activity of existing private sector lenders. I give way.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you very much. On capitalisation, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm what percentage of the bank's initial capitalisation will be in the form of financial transactions money from the UK Treasury?
Derek Mackay.
Well, can I say I think it's well understood that it is substantially financial transactions in the early years. We'll look at expanding the products. I would object to the language, it's Treasury's money. I would argue it's Scotland's money, and of course we are reinvesting that in Scotland. But it is true to say it's largely financed through those financial transactions, which is available to be spent within the private sector, particularly on those kind of investments that I've been talking about. As highlighted by the implementation plan, committing £2 billion to the bank over the next 10 years equates to 1.3% of Scotland's GDP and is therefore in line with the level of capitalisation committed by comparative institutions across the world. Indeed, in its Stage 1 report, the committee has acknowledged that the £2 billion over 10 years that we've committed to capitalise the bank, it represents a very good starting point. Presiding Officer, the bill we are debating today is an enabling piece of legislation. It places a duty on Scottish ministers to establish the bank as a public limited company and gives ministers the necessary powers to capitalise the bank. The bill also enshrines a role for Parliament by ensuring that parliamentary approval is needed before any changes to the provision of the bank's Articles of Association. And I'm pleased that the committee has been supportive of the general approach that we have taken. The recommendations set out in committee Stage 1 report are welcome and constructive, and I've provided a written response to the committee, accepting many of the recommendations, and for the benefit of members who are present, I'll briefly set out some key parts of that response. The Government has accepted the committee's recommendations that the bank's role in achieving social and environmental value alongside financial returns are clarified. Consequently, we are considering potential amendments to the ancillary objects that would give effect to this, and I want to engage with members on that. And we're also considering the committee's recommendation that the bank not be given a target rate of return for its first years of operation. Whilst we recognise that the principle behind this recommendation is constructive, its implications need to be fully considered. I've already mentioned the need for the bank to become financially self-sustaining. A commitment to a rate of return may also be necessary to meet the state aid requirements that apply to the bank. But as I say, we'll give that further consideration. Now, when giving evidence to the committee on the bill, I committed to engage with Parliament in development of the bank's missions, and I'm pleased that this proposal has been welcomed. And again, I'll engage with members across the chamber in looking at the missions and working in a collaborative fashion. In a similar way, I engaged on a cross-party basis on the National Performance Framework, which I know was welcomed by members across the chamber. We've also accepted the committee's recommendation to consider potential Stage 2 amendments to provide for a process by which Parliament can be formally consulted on future missions as well. So the committee also made recommendations regarding the role and membership of the advisory group. The Government has accepted the recommendation that the chair of the advisory group should not be a member of the bank's board, and I can also clarify that the role of the group will be to advise ministers and not the bank itself. We do, however, have concerns about providing for the advisory group in the bill. Specifically, this may prove overly prescriptive as to the mechanisms by which Scottish ministers seek advice. I am, however, again keen to hear members' views on this matter in light of the proposals for the advisory group that we have now published. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, the establishment of the Scottish National Investment Bank will be a substantial good for the economy and therefore the people of Scotland. And today's debate is a key staging post along the way to creating that long-standing institution in the Scottish economy, capable of driving the positive changes that we all want to see. So I look forward to the debate, and I'm therefore very pleased to move that the Scottish Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Scottish National Investment Bank Bill.
I now call Gordon Lyndhurst on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. What's in a name? The Scottish National Investment Bank certainly has Scottish in it. The intention is that its reach be national and its purpose will be investment. But this is not a bank, at least not a retail bank. As one witness told us, and I quote, essentially, SNIB is an example of that great Scottish invention, the investment trust. It is not really a bank. So the bill to enable the bank that's not really a bank is not quite the whole story either. As the Cabinet Secretary has indicated, much of the detail is to be found elsewhere, in the Articles of Association and various other supporting materials, strategies, plans, frameworks, charts. And some of these documents are still in draft form or will be left for the bank itself to devise. I shall not try to cover everything we had to say about the bill as a committee, about the bill itself or these other component parts, but let me focus on some aspects. Patience and purpose, inclusive growth, and missions. What is it the bill imposes as a duty on the Scottish Government to establish? It is both a PLC and a non-departmental public body, so the bank will be an unusual body, one that is expected to act commercially while at the same time seeking economic, societal and environmental returns. Like the British Business Bank, the plan is to become a funder of funders, to crowd in other investment. The emphasis is to be on long-term, or what is called patient capital, informed by a mission-led approach. Hopes for what the bank can achieve are vertiginously high, but we must look beyond the short-termism and limited perspective of the electoral cycle. As one witness put it, we are constantly faced with people trying to rewire the building with the power still switched on. I'm not sure that that might also be applied to Westminster at the minute, but in any event. Another witness cautioned against criticism in the first few years, advising, most of the bad news comes early. The lemons ripen before the plums. And if I may throw another metaphor into the mix, we were told there will be red ink spilled in its annual reports and accounts every year until 2023. If you want long-term patient capital, you have to have long-term patient investors. Now, the economist Mariana Mazzucato underlined the importance of finding the right partners, those able to subscribe to the mission-oriented ethos. Rather than just, quoting her, rather than just handout machines, she favoured those public banks which, quote, pick the willing, not the winners. She also told us, the bank is a wonderful experiment in Scotland to see precisely what it would be like to transform our imagination of what the public sector is for. The committee was not convinced that the language of the bill matches that aim for the bank to be transformative. We asked the Scottish Government to reflect on the wording of the objects set out in Section 2, and the Cabinet Secretary has already referred to this. We also invited consideration of how non-financial returns can be anchored in the bill. How do we measure success? The use of a balanced scorecard was mentioned in an earlier document, the implementation plan. However, it does not feature in the bill or anywhere else. The Scottish Government has said it would bring forward amendments at stage 2 to address these points, and the committee welcomes that undertaking. The bill's equalities impact assessment should also be mentioned, as it was not so well received by some. The Scottish Government has accordingly now issued a fully revised assessment, and that can of course be read for its detail elsewhere. This brings us then to the theme of inclusive growth, a term frequently used in policy speak, but subject to considerable interpretation. And indeed, the committee has highlighted as much in numerous pieces of work this session. Research by IPPR Scotland on behalf of the Poverty and Inequality Commission was published in June. It stated, and I quote, "The Scottish Government and its agencies could be clearer and more consistent in their definition of inclusive growth and demonstrate how this applied definition translates into practice." The Poverty and Inequality Commission itself concluded that, quote, "Inclusive growth appears to be more of a concept than something which results in a tangible outcome." But the Commission found it heartening that inclusive growth was to be built into the bank from the start. It did, however, want to ensure the agenda, and I quote, "penetrates into the heart of economic policy making." We as a committee recommended the Scottish Government give careful consideration to these research findings, particularly how it can translate the theory into a clearer vision with tangible delivery. Our concern is that without clarity, the bank will focus or could focus only on financial returns. So we welcome the positive response in the form of the Fairer Scotland Duty Assessment, which is yet another document in a crowded field, but one that recommends, and I quote, "The Scottish Government review the ancillary objects contained within the bill, utilising its position as a cornerstone in Scotland's economic architecture to shape an economy that is diverse, democratic, and which enhances societal well-being." That's a slightly long-winded quote, perhaps, Deputy Presiding Officer, but worth sticking with. For, if one reads the quote carefully, in its own circuitous way, the Scottish Government is telling itself it should listen to the committee. And of course, with that, the committee can only heartily agree. The final issue I wish to touch on concerns the bank's vision and the setting of its missions. Missions to meet such major societal challenges as carbon reduction or the provision of social care. Missions calling for multiple solutions from multiple sectors by multiple players. Professor Mazzucato said, "I encourage the committee to keep provoking on that point." Indeed we shall. We called for the Parliament to have an input to the formulation of the missions, not just a roundtable approach, useful as that can be, but a formal consultation process too. Something akin to those mechanisms which have been devised for climate change and planning legislation. And the Scottish Government said it will, and I quote, "give consideration to bringing forward amendments to this effect." I rather hope that that is a non-committal way of committing. But maybe I'm misreading the coded language of bureaucracy. It was Bob Hope who said, "A bank is a place that will lend you money if you can prove that you don't need it." Well, what is envisaged for the SNIB runs very much counter to that caricature. It is intended to be a public bank to drive transformative change, one that is intended to be independent but accountable, and permanent but adaptable, with a long-term patient view. And to that end, we set out in our committee report 19 recommendations. Our own balanced scorecard reads as follows: roughly half accepted, a couple declined, and the rest under review, which reminds one of the three options set out in the parable of the talents for investment. So there are several areas where the Scottish Government has undertaken, as already said, to bring forward Stage 2 amendments, and we shall study the detail of these in due course. We also look forward to further engagement on the Parliament's role in framing the bank's missions, but on this basis we do recommend the general principles of the bill be approved, and I look forward to other contributors to this debate. Thank you.
I call Dean Lockhart for 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me start by saying we agree with the objectives underlying the establishment of the bank, and we will be supporting the motion today. We agree that Scotland needs more long-term patient capital, that firms looking to expand need more support, and that we need to see a transformational change in Scotland's economy. Just last week, we had confirmation that Scotland's economy is contracting, growing at half of the rate of the rest of the UK economy. Productivity continues to lag in the third division. Wages and tax revenues are falling further behind the rest of the UK, resulting in a record fiscal deficit in Scotland, higher than any other country in Europe. So the need for transformation to reverse Scotland's decline into a low-growth, low-wage economy is clearer than ever. And development banks can make this transformational change. There are clear examples in Singapore, Germany and elsewhere. But this can only happen when the development bank is part of a coherent economic policy framework and has absolute clarity on strategy and objectives. This was recognised in this chamber last year when we first debated the bank, when an all-party motion agreed that a cluttered policy landscape leads to confusion, a lack of alignment, duplication and weakened accountability, agreed by all MSPs. And that's the overriding concern we have about this legislation. Not the draft bill itself, which is enabling legislation, but the context, the policy context within which the bank is being introduced. The ongoing confusion, clutter, duplication and lack of alignment which characterises this government's approach to the economy, and which means there is a real risk the bank will fail to meet its ambitious objectives. Section 2 of the draft bill states that the bank must invest in inclusive economic growth, but evidence given to the committee has time and again shown there is fundamental confusion over this policy of inclusive growth. According to Scottish Enterprise, what the concept means to one person is different from what it means to another. There is no single measure of inclusive growth. According to Highlands and Islands Enterprise, we agree that inclusive growth is difficult to measure. And a leading economist made the observation, we do not have a firm handle on inclusive growth. If inclusive growth is to be a central part of the bank's objectives, the Scottish Government must clarify precisely what it means and how it will be measured. And not just for the bank itself, I will in a second, not just for the bank itself, but for other enterprise agencies so that they are all aligned in their economic targets. I'll give way.
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way. I just wonder if he overstates the case slightly, because there is broad agreement on a lot of things. For example, Scottish Enterprise and HIE have not been very good at bringing women into growing businesses and encouraging them. And I think everyone across the chamber agrees that that is part of the inclusive growth we want to see.
Dean Lockhart.
Well, I'd say to Mr Mason, when he was a member of the committee, he also heard evidence from many witnesses that inclusive growth as a concept means different things to different people. And I'm a great believer that if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. And I think that's part of the confusion around the objectives of the bank. The guidance I'm talking about doesn't need to be in the legislation itself. It can be in the form of public guidance to all enterprise agencies, but we look forward to the Cabinet Secretary clarifying what the centrepiece of his economic strategy actually means. The committee also heard concerns over the costs involved in setting up and running the bank, with the Royal Society of Edinburgh giving evidence that the £25 million annual running costs are, in their words, very high. This £25 million is in addition to the £120 million of operating costs of the other enterprise agencies, meaning that the Scottish taxpayer is spending £150 million a year in running costs for those agencies before a single penny is invested in the economy. So we need to ensure we see a real return on this investment, along the lines which the British Business Bank delivers for the UK Treasury, which has a target rate of return of over 2.5%. Again, this target does not need to be part of the formal legislation, but but we need to have clear targets to monitor the medium and long-term performance of the bank once it is up and running. And on that point, I agree with the Cabinet Secretary. The targets should only apply once the bank is up and running. Another fundamental question the Scottish Government has failed to adequately address is whether there will be sufficient demand in the economy for the additional funding offered by the bank, and the related question of whether the existing enterprise agencies are fully resourced to identify those new investment opportunities. And we saw those problems in the context of the Scottish Growth Scheme, which has only invested a quarter of the money promised because there wasn't sufficient demand in the underlying economy to pick up the £500 million promised. The committee also heard evidence that the bank itself will not act as the originator of funding opportunities. This means the bank will have to rely on the existing enterprise agencies, which will be operating under existing budgetary and resource constraints. This therefore raises the question of whether the existing enterprise agencies are properly resourced and fully able to deliver this transformational increase in business investment. And we're yet to see a convincing plan or evidence from the Scottish Government that it has a delivery plan in place, either through the bank or through the enterprise agencies, to identify this transformation in demand in the economy. The Cabinet Secretary also needs to confirm whether the budget of the enterprise agencies will be increased to deal with the extra demands placed upon them. We heard from Highlands and Islands Enterprise that to prepare for the SNIB coming on stream, they have hired one additional person, which in my mind doesn't strike me as a transformational change. Presiding Officer, in later stages of the bill, we will also seek assurances from the Scottish Government that it will avoid calls for a series of restricted areas of investment by the bank, that the bank will not be used to prop up failing business or declining sectors, that the bank will avoid duplication with the multitude of enterprise agencies and initiatives, one which a witness referred to as a Venn diagram on steroids, and that the bank will continue and expand on the co-investment programmes which the Scottish Investment Bank has successfully pioneered. Deputy Presiding Officer, let me turn to the strategic missions of the bank. The Programme for Government announced that securing the transition to net zero will be the bank's primary mission, and a key element of the bank's work will be to help shape and deliver commercially investable low-carbon markets. We agree with those missions, but again, we need to see details of how this is going to be delivered, because the SNP has failed over the past 12 years to deliver real economic benefits and jobs from the low-carbon markets. This was made clear by the STUC earlier this year when it highlighted the negative balance of trade in the low-carbon sector which Scotland has. We import £230 million more of low-carbon in the low-carbon economy than we export. So again, I look forward to hearing from the Cabinet Secretary on how the Scottish Government will avoid repeating the same mistakes of the past in respect of the development of low-carbon markets. Deputy Presiding Officer, we will be lodging additional amendments to the draft legislation, amendments which will bring the legislation in line with best practice and how the British Business Bank operates. This will include the requirement in Section 12 for the Scottish Government to consult with and seek agreement with the bank's Board of Directors before any change is made to the strategic missions. We believe and agree the bank should operate independently, and any change in mission should only be following consultation and following seeking agreement with the bank's Board of Directors. In conclusion, we will support the establishment of the bank at stage 1, but we will also call on the Scottish Government to provide specific assurances in the legislation and otherwise to address the concerns we will outline today. Thank you very much.
I call Richard Leonard for up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In this debate this afternoon, the Scottish Labour Party is making the case for the active state, the innovative state, for the developmental state. That's our guiding principle, and that's our call to action in considering this bill. We do not simply want, and the people of this country do not simply want, a residual state which is reactive, which steps in only at the point of market failure. We need a different allocation of resources than would simply be delivered by the market. And that is what the establishment of a Scottish National Investment Bank should be about. So the purpose of the bank that we must create with this legislation cannot simply be about the best rate of financial return and the best rate of financial return alone. It must be ethical. It must take account of the strategic interests of the wider economy, like the urgent need to tackle climate change. It must be empowered to help build a more equal and a more democratic economy too. It must be on the side of the people, because we live in an economy which is too often unjust, which is in too many areas inefficient, with long hours and low wages, with inequalities and all too often discrimination in the labour market, with low rates of capital investment and low rates of productivity. And let me say that we will only tackle the productivity gap in our economy if we tackle the production gap in our economy. And we will only do that if we tackle the investment gap. And a properly resourced National Investment Bank is the right way to begin to address that gap. So the Scottish Labour Party wants intervention which is developmental, not defensive, which is industrially radical, not industrially conservative. And we want to lock in the public ownership status of the bank so that there can be no repeat of the Green Investment Bank sell-off. This Parliament must learn the lessons of that initiative. In the financial memorandum to accompany this bill, the government claims that their level of capitalisation is, and I quote them, both ambitious and achievable. Well, there is little doubt that it is achievable. Of course it is, but it lacks ambition. £2 billion to capitalise the bank over 10 years may seem like a lot, but it represents less than 1.4% of a rise in overall Scottish business investment per year. So Labour is proposing, in our plans for a UK-wide national investment bank, £20 billion over 10 years available for industrial investment in Scotland. That's the kind of transformative change. That's the kind of step change that the Scottish economy needs. I've argued in recent weeks that the restrictions on Scottish Government borrowing powers should be lifted, and I believe that rule should apply to the Scottish National Investment Bank as well, as the Scottish TUC have called for in their submission. We welcome Object C listed on the face of the bill in the bank's Articles of Association, the object of promoting and developing the activities of small and medium-sized enterprises, but Object E, which sets the bank the goal of contributing to the achievement of the Scottish Government's economic policy objectives, will mean, unless the Government amends its economic policy objectives, that the bank's investments will be in pursuit not simply of small and medium-sized enterprise development and the nourishment of indigenous industrial growth, but in the pursuit of mobile foreign direct investment, with the inevitable result that the Scottish economy would be not less, but even more of a branch plant economy as a result of the new bank's creation, and we must guard against this. On governance, the bank should be answerable to ministers, of course it should, but it should be answerable and fully accountable to this Parliament as well. Its strategic framework, the setting of the bank's goals, its performance objectives, and the monitoring of them must be subject to parliamentary scrutiny, and so public scrutiny, as well as ministerial scrutiny. The main board and the advisory board should be gender balanced, and it should reflect the diversity of our society. And both boards should contain trade union and industrial voices in significant measure, not token seats, but meaningful representation. We need to set clear guidance on maximum salary ratios in the new bank, so that the ratio of the chief executive's remuneration, not just salary, but overall remuneration, should be limited, perhaps to no greater than 20 times that of the lowest paid worker, and arguably significantly less. It was John Maynard Keynes who said, when the capital development of a country becomes the byproduct of the activities of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done. And he was right. So we welcome an alternative to the model of dispersed ownership and share listings, an alternative to the model based on financial institutions looking for a quick return, and the ever-constant threat of takeover. Everyone has agreed that we need longer time horizons and more patient capital, that we need industrial interests to predominate, not the commercial interests of the City of London. We need to rebalance the economy and tackle the highly centralised UK economy. We will not solve every problem in the Scottish economy with this bill and the establishment of a National Investment Bank for Scotland. And we need to make sure that this is not another government proposal overflowing with spin but underwhelming with substance. This bill nonetheless represents a starting point, and it's a starting point that we can improve upon. We can establish a bank which is accountable. We can establish a bank that has clear objects whose overarching aim is to build the economy from the bottom up. We can establish one that is financing the just transition from a carbon-based to a non-carbon-based economy. One that is promoting democratic forms of ownership, including cooperatives and employee ownership. And we can establish one where the right voices and values sit at the heart of it, not just at the start, but for the long term, by building this into the legislation. And so I ask the Cabinet Secretary this afternoon to hear these views and respond positively to them, listening to Parliament and agreeing to radical reforms and constructive suggestions would not be a sign of weakness but a sign of strength. So I hope that the government is listening, and I hope that it is prepared to act. Thank you.
Call on Andy Whiteman for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. And Greens support the establishment of the National Investment Bank. We have an economy which over the last 40 years has been run in the interest of private capital rather than the public interest. An economy where the return to labour over the past 20 years has declined in relationship to the return to capital. And an economy where the public sector, both at a local level, has been in retreat, has lost the means, the will and the courage to take its proper role in the economy to advance the public interest. So it's been it's been very refreshing indeed in recent years to see an increasingly positive case being made for an economy where the public interest is placed more at the heart of economic policy. And I want to pay tribute to a range of thinkers who have advocated the creation of such a bank. This includes the New Economics Foundation, Friends of the Earth Scotland, Commonweal, and the Move Your Money campaign, whose 2016 report, Banking for the Common Good, outlined the vision of what a state investment institution could do and the role it could play in Scotland. And in the context of this bill as well, such thinkers very much include Mariana Mazzucato, whose 2013 book, The Entrepreneurial State, debunked many of the myths around the role the state can play in the economy. And her evidence to the committee was both refreshing and encouraging. And we know that public investment banks can work. In fact, in this debate in May 2018, the then Cabinet Secretary Keith Brown noted that countries including China, Germany, are confronting key social and environmental challenges in this way. And he cited the example of the German KfW Bank supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, export promotion, environmental protection, innovation and international development. And in this context, other countries provide examples of far more sustainable models of banking in general, such as the German Sparkassen, which are 431 locally owned savings banks that own the 8 Landsbanken and work with the German State Investment Bank, KfW, which the Cabinet Secretary referred to make loans. And indeed, the Sparkassen provide 45% of all long-term business lending in Germany in 2012, which was more than double that provided by German commercial banks. And so there is a lesson here, I think, from which we need to learn as a matter of urgency, because as Professor Mazzucato said in the Spectator magazine last year, many businesses that we are told are value creators are actually value extractors. And indeed, in an interview in the New Statesman the same week, she pointed out that the financial services industry was never even included in GDP until the early 1970s, because many such services are no more than transactional services and add nothing to economic activity. Presiding Officer, Greens have set out the broad parameters in recent weeks of a Scottish Green New Deal, and central to this is the need for investment in a new green economy. And the role of the Scottish National Investment Bank, therefore, should be central to delivering that. And with that in mind, we would like to see some changes to the bill, including the following. First of all, a clearer articulation of the purpose The committee remains to be persuaded that the language of the bill fully matches the ambitions for the bank to be transformative. Indeed, in the implementation plan, the original vision was for a bank that would be responsible for a step change in growth for the Scottish economy by powering innovation and accelerating the move to a low-carbon, high-tech, connected, globally competitive and inclusive economy. Now, I don't personally agree with those words. I will just in 1 second. But the point is that there's no vision set out in the bill, and that needs to be addressed. I give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Derek Mackay.
Would the member, though, accept that the enabling legislation takes us so far in ensuring that the foundations of the bill are there provided for in law, but there is far more scope for that transformative language and vision and purpose to feature in all the other documentations that will drive the bank? So it's arguably its absence in the legislation is the nature of legislation, but must be there in the other associated documents to drive that transformation that Andy Whiteman and others seek.
Andy Whiteman.
Well, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that. I mean, that's an important debate. We could have at stage 2 about how much of this language might be included in the bill. I take the point very much as the very framework bill. It just tells ministers to set up a PLC, but I think there's more we could do on the face of the bill to reflect some of the ambition that has been noted that this will deliver. On climate, as the Cabinet Secretary noted in the programme for government, the First Minister states that securing the transition to net zero will be the bank's primary mission, and we of course agree with that, and it's vital therefore in our view that that objective is set out clearly in the face of the bill, both in section 2 on the bank's Articles of Association and in section 11 on missions. And I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could comment on this in winding up, or the Minister indeed. Another area we'd like to discuss some changes are in section 1 of the bill. So the bill provides that the sole member of the bank shall be Scottish ministers. Now, the Cabinet Secretary will be aware that the German Public Development Bank, KfW, is 80% owned by the federal government and 20% by the states. Now, given the vital role that local government plays and will continue to play in tackling climate change and promoting economic development, there's a good argument for them to have a stake in the bank, and I'd welcome the Minister's view on that. On missions, we certainly agree, of course, that the transition to net zero be incorporated, but we also believe it should be a statutory mission on the face of the bill. And more generally, it's notable that while any changes to the bank's Articles of Association set out in the bill can only be amended with parliamentary approval, the missions are to be set solely by Scottish ministers with no parliamentary involvement. And the Cabinet Secretary said in his opening remarks that he intends to bring forward amendments that would allow Parliament to be consulted on those. We think that any mission, however, should be subject to a vote and parliamentary approval in Parliament, just as changes to the memo and arts would be. And finally, Presiding Officer, on ethics and equalities, the committee highlighted the poor quality of the equality impact assessment, and also whilst an ethical basis for investment was recommended in the implementation plan, there's no provision in the bill. So we suggest this could be overcome by the incorporation of an ethics and equalities committee in section 9 of the bill. Presiding Officer, Greens support this bank and this bill. There's more work to be done, but we'll vote for the motion this evening. Thank you.
Now Colin Willie-Rennie for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The impact of Brexit is hitting investment, jobs and living standards. We saw that in the woeful GDP figures last week, which mirrored figures for the rest of the United Kingdom. And Brexit hasn't even happened yet. It shows why, for the sake of our economy, jobs, livelihoods and public services, we do need to stop Brexit. But here, opportunities to invest in talents of our people through education and mental health have been missed. Government initiative after government initiative has failed to deliver a kickstart to the economy. The Scottish National Investment Bank must be different, not at least for the sake of the planet. The programme for government rightly committed to putting the transition to net zero at the heart of the bank's work, but that primary mission needs to be properly reflected in the legislation underpinning it, as well as the depth and breadth of its work. We've already heard the committee concluded that the language of the bill left something to be desired. It said it wasn't persuaded it matches the ambitions for the Scottish National Investment Bank to be transformative. As Friends of the Earth pointed out, the legislation in its current form doesn't mention climate change once. The bank is to focus not just on fixing market failures, but also creating and shaping new markets and tackling societal changes. There is no bigger challenge than the climate emergency. It needs to help drive the transition away from carbon-dependent industries. It should be able to make a distinct approach to risk management, with an appetite to absorb some of the risk that developing green industries are vulnerable to. And the promise to begin investing in 2020 needs to be kept. The Scottish Growth Scheme took forever to pay out a penny, but the climate cannot wait. We know how important it is to turn around the situation just within the next few years. We know the Scottish Government's action is going to have to step up a gear after Parliament yesterday agreed to Liam MacArthur and Claudia Beamish's bid to strengthen the interim emissions targets. Other countries are already investing accordingly. KfW, which already been mentioned, the National Investment Bank in Germany, once focused on post-war reconstruction, now has climate change and the environment as one of its central missions. And under my party's plans, the Scottish Bank would be complemented by a new UK-wide green investment bank. We set up one before, only for the Conservatives to sell it off. The replacement will channel investment into zero-carbon infrastructure for power, heat, transport and afforestation. I want the UK to be the green finance capital of the world. The principles of the Scottish National Investment Bank have been outlined. The bank itself is expected to pay the living wage, but I would be grateful if the Minister could provide reassurance today on whether it will provide finance to companies that do not pay the living wage. I don't want to see a repeat of what happened with Amazon, being given millions of pounds of public money while turning a blind eye to the needs of its workers. It is expected that the bank will develop a code of ethics that goes beyond regulatory requirements and adopts a best practice approach. But will payment of the living wage be incorporated into that code and not just for the bank's own workers? Could it be put on the face of the bill, for example? Because healthy employment practices lead to a healthier economy as well. In the course of promoting inclusive growth, yes, certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
In an aim to be helpful, there are many matters that are right to propose but may not necessarily fit within the primary legislation, for example, definition of living wage, but should absolutely be considered in other places to achieve the same outcome of ensuring payment of the living wage, but maybe the primary legislation is not the appropriate place to put it, but the desirability of that outcome should be considered elsewhere.
Willie Rennie.
Well, I know we're due to have a discussion about the bank, and perhaps we can go into some of those details as to why it would not be appropriate to go on the face of the bill. But I'm grateful for the Minister's guarantees, as such as they are, that he's given today. In the course of promoting inclusive growth, the bank, like the rest of us, will be faced with the challenge of automation and what that means for jobs in the future. It was brought into focus again this week. Dame Deirdre Hutton, the head of the Civil Aviation Authority, said that Thomas Cook was operating on brochures, whereas everyone else had moved onto barcodes. And the demise of Thomas Cook will lead to a fresh focus on the future of our high streets. More customer-facing jobs will go. There will be more empty units. The Federation of Small Business Scotland have suggested that, under its inclusive growth mission, the bank support efforts to protect the vibrancy of local communities for the long term. It could focus on areas where low levels of entrepreneurship, low economic activity and high unemployment, those areas which the FSB says struggle to attract the private investment that could transform their fortunes because they are less certain to generate returns. We can't halt the march of technology progress, but we can take steps to ensure everyone benefits from it. We will be supporting the bill this evening at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Rennie. And we move to the open debate. I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Tom Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have been called to speak in the Stage 1 debate this afternoon on the Scottish National Investment Bank Bill. This is indeed a landmark bill, for it will see Scotland join the growing number of countries which have set up their own national investment banks, and I think it has been recognised. that the drive to do so has been led in part by the need to reevaluate post the 2007-8 financial crash the best way in which to fund projects that will be transformative and support innovation, given the retreat of many commercial banks from capital investment. At the same time, there is also a demonstrable need to secure long-term investment in small to medium-sized enterprises to promote growth, in particular in areas falling within the mission to be set forth, given again the disinclination in general of commercial banks to lend with regard to what are deemed to be less attractive prospects from a short-term commercial perspective. That is to say, they are not prepared to provide so-called patient finance. This bill will provide for the setting up of a Scottish National Investment Bank as a public limited company to be established in 2020. It is an enabling bill, and hence much of the detail will require, as has been said, to be developed out with the confines of the bill itself. Whilst I understand that for some of those who have made submissions this is frustrating, but nonetheless, as with any enabling framework bill, I believe there must be a balance struck. However, it would be helpful in this regard if the Cabinet Secretary could provide some more detail as to exactly how the provisions of the key document, the Articles of Association, are to be developed from here on in, and also how they can be subject to appropriate scrutiny. And whilst I do understand that the Articles of Association represent a legal agreement as between the bank and the Scottish Government, there must surely be an appropriate mechanism that can be found to ensure meaningful engagement. And I believe this should also apply to the important issue of the general principles to underpin the investment policy. As far as the proposed objects of the bank are concerned, concerns also had been raised that the vision set out clearly in the implementation plan had not been elaborated on in the bill itself. And I'm pleased indeed to note that the Cabinet Secretary has undertaken to consider the matter and to bring forward amendments at stage 2 that will ensure alignment between the objects of the bank, the vision set out in the implementation plan, and the anchoring of non-financial returns in the bill. Indeed, whilst it must be recognised that there must be a financial return, this is a bank, it is at the same time to be recognised that there must be the so-called balanced scorecard with wider economic, social and environmental returns also to be factored in. Turning to the proposed capitalisation of the bank, it has been stated that this is to be £2 billion over 10 years. And again, there are differing views here, and some argue that this is not enough. However, as also has been said, it is worth noting that the sum represents about 1.3% of GDP and therefore falls well within the parameters of international practice in this regard, where we see a range from around 0.5% to 1.5% of GDP. It is also worth noting that Benny Higgins, who developed the implementation plan, has said, and I quote, £2 billion strikes a decent balance between aspiration and impact. Of course, it has to be said, Presiding Officer, and it cannot be overstated, that in the current devolved setup where Scotland does not have access to all her resources and where we indeed see limits on our borrowing powers, any such initiative setting up the National Investment Bank must be affordable within the devolved settlement. As far as the estimated running costs of the bank are concerned, indeed, the Royal Society for one has queried whether the proportion of around £25 million in the context of administering a fund of £200 million is of the right order, and perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could reflect on that further in his summing up. And finally, as far as governance issues are concerned, I note that the debate that has taken place thus far has focused to a considerable degree on the make-up and role of the advisory committee. I think it is important that whilst membership of the committee should be indeed drawn widely, at the same time it must be clear that the advisory committee is indeed to advise Scottish Government ministers and not the bank directly. It is not a bank by committee. Rather, I believe that for the bank to be successful, it must have operational independence necessary to ensure that it can function and do the great job that we all hope it will do. Presiding Officer, as I said at the outset, the new Scottish National Investment Bank will be pivotal to securing a transformative impact on Scotland's economy. It is clearly intended to provide additionality and not to duplicate the existing landscape in terms of the enterprise bodies, Scottish Futures Trust and indeed local government. Whilst many key issues remain to be developed, it is heartening to note that the Government has engaged widely and is committed to continue such wide engagement as these issues are worked through. I very much welcome that approach, Presiding Officer, and I look forward to further detailed information coming from the Finance Secretary over the coming weeks and months. As the Cabinet Secretary has said, the new Scottish National Investment Bank will allow things to happen in our country that otherwise would not happen, to transition to a low-carbon economy, to seek to tackle the demographic challenges we face, both in terms of an ageing workforce and in terms of health inequalities, and indeed to reflect Scotland's challenges resulting from our geography and our regional diversity. I find that a very exciting prospect indeed, Presiding Officer, and I'm happy to support the bill at stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I call Tom Mason to be followed by Alex Neil. Tom Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A new investment bank, such as the one proposed today, has the potential to grow our economy and provide for the economic development of our towns and cities. With this in mind, I am supportive of the bill that has been set out today, although I do not just look forward to the opportunities it can provide, but try also to keep one eye on the challenges that should be addressed during the latter stages of the bill in order to make the bank as successful as possible. Since the bill's introduction earlier this year, the Scottish Government have changed the remit of the bank to focus on environmental issues, and given the salience of such issues, it's easy to understand the reasoning. It is right that we continue to increase our efforts to ensure that high standards of environmental protection, and so there are moves that can be welcomed. However, it is vital that business sectors that invest in renewables, for example, are able to work with the bank, even if their original area of practice does not fit in within this model. I'm thinking of the number of companies in my region that are involved in the fossil fuel industry, but also expanding their investment in greener energy solutions. Such firms, not all multinational giants, I might add, shouldn't be precluded from working with the bank if they could help contribute to reducing emissions over the long term. Now, another issue lies in where the overall control of the bank's mission sits. As currently proposed, ministers can dictate to the bank its objectives, but there is no requirement for any consultation with the Economy Committee, Parliament as a whole, or the directors of the bank itself. I think it is important to include the need for such discussions in the bill itself. It would be unfortunate if, at any point in the future, the bank was obliged to follow the political instructions of ministers rather than economic best practice. I note that the Economy Committee has already highlighted this in the Stage 1 report for the bill, and I hope ministers will respond in a constructive fashion. There is also vital consideration about the nature of the current stated mission of the bank. Ministers have indicated they want the bank to be quite interventionist in certain areas of the economy. Now, this is a valid viewpoint, but my concern is that it is trying to do all things to all people. Yes, it is important to consider how we deal with the climate change or our ageing population, but preferential treatment of certain sectors over others can undermine the fundamentals of the economy, and I hope the Minister will give further thought to this. Concerns have also been raised over the expectations for the bank to be self-sustaining within 5 years. The committee has taken a significant amount of evidence on this, and it would appear that ministers are being quite generous with their predictions. I know the idea that the cost of the project could spiral out of control will be entirely unfamiliar to the Scottish Government, but I urge them to think very carefully about how to manage expectations over the next few years. Finally, I do have a worry about the landscape described by Jim McCall as too cluttered. It is, in fact, Presiding Officer, that for the last few years there have been a number of arm's-length organisations trying to provide investment for businesses. Whether this is the Scottish Enterprise and their Scottish Investment Bank, the Scottish Growth Scheme, the previous idea for the Business Investment Bank, the Scottish Government have taken a number of swings at this. It hasn't worked out yet. Yet, I hope it will. Indeed, in the case of the growth scheme, it has not even managed to get close to investing half of the 500 million that was promised in 2017. There are serious questions here, and the ministers need to have a good answer. What will be the difference this time round? In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Scottish National Investment Bank is an idea that certainly has merit, but faces a number of challenges that need to be resolved before the bill is passed in order to make sure it fulfills its potential to grow our economy, create jobs and boost living standards. I do not doubt the intentions of ministers, but it clearly requires more work. It is with that spirit that I look forward to seeing amendments to the bill proposed at further stages in Parliament in order to correct the issues that the SNIB faces, and I hope ministers will be receptive to such changes. And I look forward to working with them to make them happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I call Alex Neil to be followed by Jackie Bailey. Alex.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I have to say that it's a great contrast about the civilised debate in this Parliament compared to the pantomime down the road at Westminster. Can I say, Presiding Officer, that the success of the National Investment Bank will be judged by how successfully it helps tackle the central challenges of the Scottish economy. We rely far too heavily on a small number of sectors for our entire national wealth. If you look at food and drink as one sector, oil and gas is another sector, and certain service industries, they account for something like 2/3 of everything that we produce in this country. And we need to expand our product base, our service base, and our company base, because within many of these sectors, we rely too heavily on a small number of companies for a very high proportion of what is actually produced. And of course, down the years, we've seen a situation where now you can almost count in the fingers of your hands how many companies are actually headquartered in Scotland. And as we know, if you have more companies headquartered in the country, that produces a far bigger spin-out than if you are relying so heavily on branch activities. So all of these things are extremely important. If you look at exports, we rely very heavily on a small number of products and services and companies for most of the exports from Scotland. And therefore, the key central challenge, I think, is to diversify our economic base. More companies, more SMEs, more bigger companies, more companies headquartered in Scotland, more companies exporting, more companies involved in research and development. And it's interesting comparing ourselves with those countries like, say, Finland and Norway, as well as the bigger economies like Germany, who have had very successful both national and regional investment banks almost since the war. In Finland, there is more money given in the form of credit guarantees and other facilities to their exporters in Finland than there is in the whole of the United Kingdom by the UK government. That shows you the scale of where we have to make it up in order to be competitive in the Finnish industry. A good example is shipbuilding, an industry that we gave up far, far too easily many years ago, other than what is left in the Clyde and at Rosyth. And the Finns, through the National Investment Bank, have a very vibrant shipbuilding industry and many other such industries as well. The Norwegians, through their innovation agency, are building themselves up to diversify away over time from oil and gas into a whole range of new high-tech industries. But we in Scotland, our record on research and development is appalling. In the UK, it is appalling. The average level of business research and development in the UK is less than 50% as a percentage of GDP than it is in Europe. And the level of R&D in Scotland is less than half, in the private sector, less than half what it is in the UK average because of the heavy concentration in London and the South East. So a key challenge for this body is both to increase finance to exporters as well as increase the level of research and development to help diversify into new jobs and industries. And on top of that, there are many other opportunities that we need to pursue. But let me just say a word about the money, because in first looking at it, I absolutely thought that although £200 million isn't to be scoffed at, it looked against the scale of the challenge to be fairly modest. But a key part of a national investment bank is to leverage funding from elsewhere. The worst thing that can happen is that it takes on all the risk and then other people benefit. So there will be many investments where we will be able to leverage from the pension funds and from other funds. So the whole point of this isn't the £200 million a year. If we manage to at least double that in the early years and increase that ratio further in the later years, you're talking about a total of additional £400 or £500 million a year. And once it gets a track record, then people will come to it with new ideas and demands for new funding. And it will, I think, grow in the second half of the 10-year period into spending much more and requiring much more than the original capitalisation plans, because the opportunities will be there. But the return to the Scottish economy could be very high indeed. And that's where I come to the opportunities, Presiding Officer. If you look at our future, heavily mentioned in the debate so far, are the fantastic global opportunities. Don't narrow ourselves down to the EU, slowest growing part of the global economy. Let us go out there and be global and international. That's where the big markets and the market growth is. But look at artificial intelligence, some of which is residing in here. Artificial intelligence. You take the health sector. If we develop an expertise and invest heavily in the application of artificial intelligence just into diagnostics in the health service, we can be a world leader in that field and help our health service at the same time. If you look at life sciences, the opportunity Scotland has, particularly in animal life sciences, is truly transformational. If you look at IT, one of the massive growing industries is the provision of cyber security for governments and businesses. You don't need to be physically in Australia in order to provide some cyber security services to somebody in Sydney or in Melbourne. You could do it from Glasgow. You could do it from any remote part of Scotland, and you could serve a worldwide market. The opportunities are endless, Presiding Officer. Let me say this. It's a great pity and a great tragedy we didn't do this early on in this Parliament, because 20 years down the line, we would have a booming Scottish economy, which would be top of the European League and top of the global league, and that's what we should be aiming for our country and our people.
Thank you very much. And I call Jackie Bailey to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And tempting as it is to note that Alex Neil was looking in the mirror when he was talking about artificial intelligence, I will, of course, resist. Presiding Officer, a Scottish National Investment Bank is actually not all that new as an idea. Indeed, the Scottish Investment Bank already exists in Scottish enterprise, and investment in business has existed in different forms for a number of years. Intent on a bit of nation building, of which we know the SNP are so fond, the Scottish National Investment Bank has been announced time after time by successive ministers and First Ministers. In fact, I think it's probably been announced at least 9 times over in the past 9 years. First there was John Swinney, then there was Alex Salmond, Keith Brown had a look in, Nicola Sturgeon followed, and now even Derek Mackay is in on the act. The truth is, though, and the reason it couldn't be announced earlier, is the SNP government didn't have the capital to make it fly until now. Now it's all hail the financial transaction money from the UK government. And first, I recall the SNP denouncing it. I think it was Keith Brown talked about it as just loan funding and funny money, which, of course, it is just loan funding. But now it is the very welcome money that will capitalise the bank. It does, however, need to be paid back, all £500 million of it. So I do want to ask the Cabinet Secretary to tell us how those repayments are profiled, how much and over what time frame, because I think we need to understand in totality what this will mean to the Scottish budget. Make no mistake, I am in favour of a national investment bank. Indeed, Labour's proposals, as we've already heard from Richard Leonard, would see the bank capitalised with 10 times the resources promised by the SNP. But I want to know that we're doing it in the most efficient manner possible, getting the biggest bang for the taxpayer's buck. Now, the Economy Committee, of which I'm a member, looked at the bill proposal, but it was the Finance Committee that considered the financial memorandum. And I want to firstly follow the money, as my mother always taught me to do. So financial transactions money from the UK Government of £500 million will capitalise the bank up to 2021. Scottish Government money of £1.5 billion will be provided from 2021 to 2028. That's straightforward. That's the investment part of the equation. Now let's look at the cost. Here's the headline figure that I think we haven't properly understood. By 2023-24, which is when the government expect the bank to cover its costs, the taxpayer will have borne a cumulative loss of at least £80 million. Now, I know that Dean Lockhart uses the figure of £150 million. Whichever it is a significant sum. That £80 million is to cover new staff, a chief executive, a chair, Scottish Government sponsor unit, estate costs and so on. That's at least £80 million before the bank starts to cover its operating costs. In a time of continuing austerity, that is a sizable sum of money to lose. Just think about what that could buy. Almost 3,000 nurses, almost 2,000 teachers. So we need to think carefully about what we're doing. The Royal Society of Edinburgh, in a very thoughtful submission, also noted that the projected annual running cost of £25 million to oversee an investment fund of £200 million is very high and needs to be reviewed. So let me ask a fundamental question of the Cabinet Secretary. Money is already distributed now through the Scottish Investment Bank, through the Scottish Futures Trust and through other government-controlled agencies. What review has taken place of the experience, the efficacy, the impact of those existing arrangements? Are they any good? I know he's dying to answer me. Let me finish. Right? Are they any good? Does he know? Because that informs whether what he's about to do with this bill is the right thing. So can he tell us why this approach in the bill and what additionality will the new bank provide? Because I think that's important for us going forward. Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Jackie Bailey for the question and the ability to intervene very briefly at this stage? Maybe I'll say more in the summing up. But I actually think there'll be the requirement for that ongoing review, especially to see what the final legislation looks like. I've said I'll engage with Parliament, so I think it's right to have that ongoing review of what other parts of the public sector provide and what's provided by banks elsewhere in Scotland. And then, of course, to keep that under review, to return with what financial products are available, what other parts of the system come together, also to address the clutter point that's been made by colleagues, and then return with a comprehensive plan about how that looks in a whole system approach. But I think it's a very fair challenge.
Thank you, Bailey.
And whilst I welcome that recognition from the Cabinet Secretary, my concern is we haven't done this in advance of passing legislation and spending taxpayers' money when we're not quite sure whether this is going to do the trick. So, I'm happy that he's going to do this, but I want it done now rather than some years down the line, because I think it's important for us to understand whether the bank's additionality will compensate for the cumulative multi-million-pound loss in the first 5 years. A key issue, of course, is stimulating demand. Is the Cabinet Secretary confident that there will be sufficient demand, given that the Scottish Growth Scheme, announced to considerable fanfare, has distributed a fraction of the money intended? These questions all need answers by the Cabinet Secretary. No, I don't have enough time, because if there is another more cost-effective way of achieving the same end, then we should consider it. I'm with Alex Neil in terms about his potential of a return, but we need to be convinced rather than just hoping that this will happen. Let me turn very quickly, Presiding Officer, to some of the other issues raised. I particularly want to focus on the views taken by Engender and Close the Gap. Their assessment of the equality impact assessment was that the bill was limited in scope, lacked analysis, was quite poor. Although the Cabinet Secretary has revised that assessment, which is welcome, it's very difficult to retrofit equality into policy which has already been developed. There is international evidence, a wealth of it, that gender equality is a necessary precursor to economic growth. If we want the bank to deliver for women in Scotland and women-led businesses, then this needs to be a core part of the strategy, of the implementation. It should be on the face of the bill, a view shared by many, as should be the vision and the objectives of equality and non-discrimination and socio-economic and environmental outcomes. So we influence the bank's lending policies and governance right from the very start. Presiding Officer, there will undoubtedly be many amendments to come, and I look forward to having that challenge with the Cabinet Secretary during stage 2.
Thank you very much. And I call John Mason to be followed by Jamie Green. John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And once again, I find myself speaking in a debate on an issue which came from the Economy Committee, of which I was a member when the report was prepared, although sadly I am no longer there. However, I'm happy to take part, and this was a subject where there clearly was broad agreement at the committee, perhaps unlike last Thursday's Economy Committee debate on pre-release access. As has been said, this is very much an enabling or framework bill, and the question has arisen as to whether there should be more detail actually on the face of the bill. And we faced this question previously with legislation, such as the Land Reform Bill and the Islands Bill. Clearly, too much detail in the bill can be difficult to update as circumstances change. On the other hand, too little detail could give ministers, or in this case the bank itself, too much freedom to drift away from the intentions of Parliament. So we need to get the balance right as we move on to stages 2 and 3. I personally think having a bank like this is a great opportunity, and we've had clear evidence at committee from a number of countries, including Wales, how it can be a real asset to the economy. As we noted in the report at paragraph 48, the bank will not take deposits nor borrow from anyone other than Scottish ministers. However, in the longer term, this might be something we want to revisit. I believe there are a number of individuals in Scotland, and possibly organisations as well, who would be keen to invest in Scotland's economic development through a bank like this. In fact, I have had individuals asking me personally if it will be possible for them to invest in it. Another point about the bank is that it is to provide patient finance. This could be by way of loans or equity, but it would not be grants, and it would not be to bail out struggling companies. Now, I realise the concept of patience is not always well known to politicians, who usually want to see the whole health or education system turned around between one First Minister's questions and the next. And as in business, there are likely to be failures as well as successes, as the convener said. And as the committee heard, bad news may well come sooner than good news. So I hope we can all commit at this stage now to being patient and not jumping to criticise the government of the day if the first investment were to go belly up. To move on to some specific topics that have aroused interest, first of all, setting a target rate of return. The committee has said in its report around paragraphs 201 to 203 that the rate of return should not be the be-all and end-all, and that evaluation of the bank should be wider, including social and environmental impact. We then suggested that we should be particularly careful in the early years, say the first 2 to 3 years, and recommended that a target should not be set or applied in the short term. Therefore, I was particularly interested in the government's response to this at paragraph 40 in their letter of 26th August. I think there is agreement, as paragraph 43 says, that the bank needs to cover its operating costs, there have to be sufficient financial returns to repay the Treasury, and there must be sufficient returns to grow its asset base, enabling future rounds of investment in Scottish companies and communities. And at paragraph 45, that we do not want, as an unintended consequence, to have decision-making focused on the short term. But paragraph 46 makes an extremely important point, that if the bank does not have a target rate of return, it might be more susceptible to political pressure to be a lender of last resort to distressed companies. There might also be issues with state aid rules, whether these are decided by the European Commission or the Competition and Markets Authority. Secondly, on ethics, moving on to ethics and the suggestion of an ethics committee, the Economy Committee had asked the Government to consider such a committee being specifically required on the face of the bill. The Government responds in their paragraph 61 that ethics might be best considered as a main board duty. Now, I do get the point that ethics should be central to the whole organisation. However, I think in balance I would like to see a committee which specifically focused on this topic and could then take a considered position to the main board. I do not think it's a particularly bad thing for the respective chairs of, say, the Ethics Committee on the one hand and Investment Committee on the other hand, to be putting forward slightly different arguments in front of the main board for a decision to be made. I'm more relaxed about whether this needs to be on the face of the bill or not. And thirdly, on the question of sustainable growth and the environment, there have been a number of briefings for today's debate, including from Friends of the Earth, SCVO and Social Enterprise Scotland, emphasising the importance of the environment and other issues. It seems to me there is a broad agreement on the need for this, although we saw yesterday in the Climate Bill debate there are differences as to how far people want us to go and how quickly. There are clearly also concerns as to what the term inclusive and sustainable economic growth might mean. I do not think many of us want unlimited economic growth with no strings attached. But perhaps the more difficult question is where all this should be written down. Should it be in the face of the actual bill itself, as some suggest? Or because we are dealing with a company in this legislation and there need to be articles of association, this does give us the option of having more detail, unlike normal legislation, in these articles of association. And they can only be changed by agreement of Parliament, so it does seem to me that they are a good place to be laying out what we want. However, as far as I can see, the wording in the draft articles on the objects of the company are exactly the same as the wording in the bill. And I would have thought there might be an opportunity for the articles to be expanded beyond what the bill states and give more of the detail that many are seeking. And I do wonder if the government is open to that.
Well, you are the members in his very last, in fact, probably not. I think you better just do a last sentence.
Well, my last 3 lines are, so in conclusion, I hope we can all support this bill today and the creation of the bank. I am sure there will be much more debate over the detail later on. Thank you.
I'm sure, Cabinet Secretary, you'll have time in your summing up. I call Jamie Green to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Very pleased to be speaking in this debate today. It's been interesting to date. The old adage is that you wait ages for a bus to turn up and then 3 come along at once. I think the same is to be said for the Scottish Government's strategy on supporting business. We've been waiting for something like this National Investment Bank for, well, since Mr Mackay's party took office. Going back as far as 2009, John Swinney said that he needed to create a vehicle that would enable us to provide the necessary long-term support and investment in the Scottish economy. Very admirable of him. In 2014, he said that he hadn't shelved the proposition of a business development bank, but he was searching for a way to do it, and, quote, I am still searching for a way to do it. 5 years later, here we are in the Chamber debating stage 1 of the Scottish National Investment Bank. I'm going to be supportive of the concept of it because I think they do have a place in modern economies. We've talked a little bit about the example of Germany and some of the successes that other countries have had in this type of financial vehicle. So I think it's, to be fair to the government, this type of vehicle is probably the right one for the purpose that it has. But the devil very much is in the detail. This type of bank really, I think, goes against the mould of what banks do and probably what governments do. Because governments are generally asked to step in when markets are failing. The aim of this bank, I hope, will be entirely different. And I hope it will genuinely be seen to shape and steer the markets rather than simply correct failures. On that point of it, yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
Do want to make it clear, if it's helpful at this point, since a number of members have raised that, yes, it will be the intention of the bank to be that economy-shaping type model, as opposed to, as it has been described and articulated by others, to support failing businesses. It should be businesses with a viable future, but one that's helped shaping our future economy as well. So that is the spirit of the bank.
And James Green, you will get your time back.
Thank you, and I'm pleased to hear that. I think that's a very positive move. I think there is certainly a theme coming through this stage one draft of it, that things like protection of the environment, social inclusion and sustainable development are, and hopefully will sit at the heart of the bank's investments. But ultimately, this is still taxpayers' money, so the money must still be invested in viable opportunities that will offer some form of return, even if it's not obviously a direct financial pound-for-pound one. I think there's nothing wrong with that concept, but it is still unclear, I think, through what the paper that we have in front of us, how the bank will achieve that. We've seen other schemes, such as the Scottish Growth scheme, which had an aim to provide £500 million of loans by 2020. Of course, we're not there yet, but we know we're substantially way below that in terms of how much it's invested to date. And I think it's true to say that this type of investment vehicle cannot be measured by the conventional tools that we use by governments or investors. I think the success or otherwise of this bank will be challenging to put a number to. And indeed, yeah, we may need to be patient, as Mr. Mason has said. But I think the availability of credit alone, whilst it is a tool, is not the only tool. Finance cannot overcome poor market conditions, it can't overcome skills deficits, and it can't overcome factors which are way outside of our control. We could argue that the government could already have played a more vital role over the past decade in fostering innovation, growth and skills. And a quite timely intervention after FMQs today, I held a reception, a meeting with Ayr Chamber of Commerce. And some of the people I met at that roundtable are real people, real small businesses and entrepreneurs, the sort of people that this bank should be seen to be helping. Entrepreneurs like Alex, who runs her own makeup company, Ruth from Ardrossan, who runs a photography business, and Gemma, who runs a wedding and events company. I was really buoyed by the enthusiasm of the room for promoting small businesses, taking on people and growing the economy of Ayrshire. And I told them I'd be speaking in today's debate about this new national bank that would promote SMEs, create and shape markets and develop enterprise where clearly the commercial models are failing them. But their question to me was, that's all very well and good, but can you ask the government, where have you been for the last decade? And how much longer do I need to wait for this type of support to be made available to me on the ground? So I hope we can get through this swiftly and get this thing established. I would like to turn technically to the bill itself in the small time I have. I'm pleased at stage one. With no respect to the people that have drafted the bill as it stands, I'm very pleased that it is stage one, because I think there are still many holes in it, and I hope that members will work constructively across the chamber to get it into a good place when it comes back. On page one of the bill itself, something that Andy Whiteman alluded to, the bank's object is giving financial assistance to commercial activities for the purpose of promoting and sustaining economic development. And that's okay if you can decipher what that actually means. It says that the bank may do anything for the purpose of its objects. The bank can only borrow from Scottish ministers. Scottish ministers appoint the executive directors, the non-executive directors, the salaries of the directors, and give direction on all of the above. The Scottish ministers will set the mission, and they will do that through the ingenious method of sending a document to the bank, and it goes into great detail about how they may do that. Scottish ministers may capitalise the bank, and it's only when you get to the very end of the bill, it's worth pointing out, the only thing that requires parliamentary approval is the procedure for modifying entrenched provisions. Chamber already looks like a marvellously non-political and independent organisation as it's currently drafted. I raise that because I think it's important that the bank does have the independence that it needs and requires to make decisions that are right as a bank and not simply under the direction of the political will of ministers. I'll conclude my comments by saying that I think there's the potential here to create something very interesting and worthwhile. But the ministers responsible for it must ensure that this isn't just a box-ticking exercise or a half-cooked plan. I support the setup of the bank, and I do hope it succeeds. But my reaction to all this is that of many folk. I'll believe it when it delivers.
Thank you very much. Mr Green, I call Polly McNeill to be followed by Joan McAlpine. Ms McAlpine is the last speaker in the open debate. Ms McNeill.
First of all, I welcome the role of the Scottish National Investment Bank and the Stage 1 debate. A bank that is not focused on profit-seeking and one that can respond quickly to Scotland's investment needs. It could be an opportunity missed. Many commentators have said that. as it doesn't have nearly enough capital, and Jackie Bailey is quite right to say that we need to get the equality commitments in there up front. The Scottish Council for Development and Industry has said that the level of capitalisation of £2 billion over 10 years does not match the scale of ambition proposed, and they say it could be challenging. But for my contribution, I want to talk about why housing should be a key mission within the Scottish National Investment Bank, and reference, I think, why it's quite an interesting forthcoming report from the think tank Commonweal. Let us not forget it was housing finance that led to the sharp practices of the mortgage market, which led to the crash developing, which deprived many people of their housing options. So we therefore, in my opinion, have to steer away from seeing housing as purely a profit-driven and commodity-based part of the economy, but rather looked at its primary purpose of creating homes. So one of the key missions of the bank, I believe, should be to build high-quality social housing. Dr. Craig Dalzell from Commonweal has written a forthcoming report, and in it he says that the current approach to house building is deeply flawed and largely revolves around the private house building market, where the politics of the social house building is limited to setting arbitrary targets of houses to build without much thought to the quality, location or infrastructure. I do agree that one of the bank's missions should be to build sufficiently high quality, publicly owned rented homes, not just as a safety net for those in need, but to exceed baseline ambitions, provide homes that are desirable and cheaper than those in the private sector. And I'm sure those who follow the housing debate don't need to be convinced that housing itself is a really important part of the economy because of the skills that we need and the infrastructure that it brings. But by guaranteeing a security of supply and legislating to fund only the highest quality housing, it could act to stabilise the private rented sector and raise the quality of housing overall. In Labour, we want to see a strategic plan for the housing sector focused on improvement of quality. It seems obvious to me that given the debate we had only yesterday on climate change reduction, that a key infrastructure project for quality homes would be to aim to reduce carbon neutral housing, or to introduce carbon neutral housing as a standard. Another reason that housing, I believe, should be a key mission of the bank is that the majority of people who are not able to or do not want to buy a house are almost wholly reliant on the private sector. More families with children are living in the private sector, and they experience dramatic rent increases in numerous parts of the country, causing hardship. This in turn is increasing the risk of the number of adults and children living in poverty, and it seems that there's an excellent case to be made here. According to Homes for Scotland, Scotland is only building 80% of the level required to meet housing needs and demand. Good housing, I'm sure we all agree, is central to a healthy population and a vibrant economy. It makes sense that the investment bank funding could be used to construct the highest quality of housing and to make sure that we help drive up the quality of housing in the private market as a whole. We support the government's plans to retrofit all buildings to EPCC by 2040. However, retrofitting existing buildings is often extremely costly, and we need to make sure that new buildings are built to the highest possible standards. Scottish Labour's Housing Commission was tasked with looking at whether a national housing agency could be an asset to the economy. It might be tasked, amongst other things, with taking a strategic approach to where the gaps lie in provision, powers for compulsory purchase order, to create new communities and to coordinate the provision of relevant skills needed on the sector. And we'll say more about that in a report when it's due for publication. Overall, I do believe that there is a very strong case that a national approach to house building could identify in the housing sector where there are gaps. And there are many organisations that support a form of a national agency, Commonweal being one of them, but also Homes for Scotland have identified over a year ago that it could play a strategic role in making sure that going forward that we retain the necessary skills for infrastructure building, and that would include housing. I believe a move towards high quality passive housing when it comes to carbon neutral homes will allow us to tackle several problems, not least the scourge of fuel poverty, but at the same time make serious inroads to decarbonising Scotland to help meet our climate change targets. Making social housing a viable option for more people through investment of the Scottish National Investment Bank will mean factors such as high heating costs could practically be eliminated. So whilst they may not fit, I think we maybe the idea of having a national investment bank, perhaps you wouldn't think of housing being a strategic part of that. I think there's a very strong case for it being a mission for those reasons. And
no, the members, you're always picking the wrong moment, Cabinet Secretary. You'll just have to deal when you're summing up. Continue, Ms McNeill. You're in your last minute.
Can I not take that? Okay. Apologies to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. Making social housing a viable option for more people through the investment will mean factors such as heating costs, as I said, could practically be eliminated. Building high-quality social homes should be part of the mission of the investment bank. And I hope the Cabinet Secretary's intervention might be to agree with that idea, hopefully anyway. And where these homes are built, they must be guided by a demand-led strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms McNeill. I call Joe McAlpine, then we move to closing speeches.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. You need not look far for evidence of systemic equality across the UK. There's a wealth gap that's rising, and due to a toxic partnership of discredited economics and Westminster ineptitude. And that inequality is social, but it's also geographic. And it is the regional divide that I want to concentrate on today, and which I hope the Scottish National Investment Bank will focus on in the future. Southern Scotland's regional economic wealth has been one of the lowest recorded amongst comparator regions across Northern Europe, and citizens in the inner London West region, where Westminster is situated, are on average 10 times better off than my constituents. Inner London is the richest region in Northern Europe, of course. This disparity is not only found in Scotland. Regions across the UK have been starved of investment by a metrocentric financial system which does not work in their interests. Indeed, across the world, we see growth focused on cities, which in turn attract more investment and talent and so on. And that's great if you live in a city, but I feel strongly representing a region that does not have a city, that no part of Scotland should be left behind. And that's why I welcome attempts by the Scottish Government to address these geographical disparities, especially in the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency, which is being set up, and the adoption of place-based inclusive growth as part of Scotland's economic strategy. My ambition for a national investment bank would be that it would complement these initiatives. I don't sit on the Economy Committee anymore, but I did sit on it in the last Parliament, and it was there that I still remember being really struck by figures that showed how difficult it was for SMEs in the rural south of Scotland to access capital, either from the private banking sector or indeed through public agencies. And I'm really pleased that the government's responding to that in a number of ways. It's vital that the bank, like the new agency, helps dismantle all barriers to sustainable growth in the south of Scotland, which is a region with so much potential and talent. So while the bank has both a national and regional remit, I'm gratified that there's a specific recognition that regional variations in productivity across Scotland must be addressed. We have heard that the bank has an unusual nature and departs from the status quo, and this is a good thing. It will be an institution underpinned by statute, with the detail contained within Articles of Association. It's uniquely Scottish. We know already that greater long-term or patient capital is needed for small and medium-sized enterprises to grow, and again, that is certainly the case in my region. I was struck by the way the committee took a wide and thematic approach to scrutiny of the bill, reflecting the bank's mission-orientated approach to not just fix market failures, but in the words of the economic advisor, Mariana Mazzucato, to create and shape new markets aimed at tackling societal changes. I know also that the bank has gained widespread support among stakeholders. The CBI Scotland have said the development of the SNIB could be a leap forward for the Scottish economy that boosts global competitiveness, supporting innovation and growth. And Social Enterprise Scotland have said it also has huge potential to transform our economy. I'm particularly pleased also to note that it will be open for business in 2020. It can't come quickly enough. Scotland has a rich, almost unparalleled history of groundbreaking invention and innovation, and is currently home to several world-class universities and centres of excellence. There's no shortage of homegrown talent, and it's time for Scotland to punch above its weight in terms of developing that talent. As so much could be achieved, therefore much is at stake, it's extremely important that careful scrutiny is given to any weaknesses or deficiencies in the bill or the proposed structure of the bank. And I would echo the other comments that have been made earlier about inadequacy in the equality impact assessment. Presiding officer, the committee has reported on ethical investment and other matters, some of which we have heard further detail on today, which all bear further reflection and consideration. For critics of a uniquely Scottish solution to address inequality, and there don't seem to be many today, and stimulate growth, I agree with others that how we work through local knowledge is extremely important, and I very much welcome the establishment of the bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Closing speeches. I call on Rhoda Grant to close for Labour. 7 minutes, please, Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour welcomes the Scottish National Investment Bank Bill. However, it does not go far enough. The bill lacks a strong objective for the bank and it lacks ambition by the government. It is inadequately capitalised. £2 million over 10 years is not enough to create a step change in our economy. It's a level that's achievable but not ambitious, as Richard Leonard said. The Scottish Labour Party would look at financing it to the tune of £20 billion over the same time frame, making a step change. This £2 billion is only £200 million a year, and the set-up costs, as Jackie Bailey pointed out, are likely to be around in the region of £80 million. That coming out of a £200 million per year budget would leave very little for investment. SCDI welcomed the sum but contrasted that level of capitalisation with the scale of the ambition set out in the vision to transform Scotland's economy. Unite was not convinced that £2 billion represented a sufficient level of capital investment to deliver real economic change, and it's cited several examples of projects that would have almost taken up the whole of the budget of the bank. The Royal Society of Edinburgh also had concerns about the level of capitalisation, restricting the number of potential missions that the bank could have. And it said that the £200 million over a year was not enough to provide investment across 3 or 4 missions, such as demographic issues and also the transition to a low-carbon economy. So the scale was not sufficient to do that. And Pauline McNeill talked about the need to build more socially rented housing. 50,000 new socially rented houses would cost over £3 billion. That's more than the entire budget set out for the bank.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for taking intervention. Does that not speak to the point, though, that the bank taken in isolation then excludes all the other figures? So actually £3 billion has been committed to meet the 50,000 target, of which the government is on track to build in terms of housing. So when considering totality of investment into our infrastructure, you have to look at the global figures and not just what is allocated through financial transactions or elsewhere for the purposes of the Scottish National Investment Bank.
Rhoda Grant.
Indeed, but if the investment bank is going to fulfil the ambition set out for it, it requires more capitalisation than already put forward by this government. Take, for example, an issue many speakers, in fact almost all speakers, spoke about was climate change and the move to a carbon neutral economy. It means that there is a whole new and growing sector in our economy that needs to be supported, and yet the bill is silent on it, pointed out by many speakers. Currently, too many of the jobs in the low carbon sector are going overseas to our competitors, and in order to make a just transition to a net zero economy, we need to ensure we grow the number of jobs in this sector and compete with overseas companies. And we also need to innovate and develop low-carbon industries. Reaching net zero will also mean that traditional high-carbon industries will decline, and that will happen. But our economic well-being and the well-being of the workforce in those sectors depends on us retraining and securing jobs in zero-carbon sectors, and especially where those skills are transferable. No one should be left behind if we are to meet our ambitions agreed by the Parliament yesterday. Many speakers also talked about lending criteria and who the bank should lend to. And it must work for all our economic generators, but it specifically will not lend to the public sector. But it must include other sectors, such as the third sector, co-ops and community bodies, because these are different businesses, which could be argued provide a much greater economic impact on their local communities. And if it is not to lend to public institutions, how can it make an impact on things such as housing that Pauline McNeill was emphasising in her speech? Meeting the challenges of the 21st century can't be met by the private sector alone. If we're going to address climate change, digitisation and the like, we need new models of public ownership and finance. And we must support our homegrown industries, as Richard Leonard cautioned against chasing foreign investment. And Alec Neil made this point as well, that very few, our economy depends on very few large companies, and very few of them are headquartered here. They can move away at any time at all. The lending criteria must embrace fair work principles. The Scottish Investment Bank should ask ethical questions of companies and customers to determine whether they are appropriate to lend to. Willie Rennie talked about the living wage and whether this was appropriate to put on the face of the bill. And I believe it is. The living wage will not change. It will keep step with the times and increase as required. So there is no reason that high-level ambitions could not be in the face of the bill. Things like our climate change targets and the like. Dean Lockhart talked about inclusive growth, and I think that is important to have in the face of the bill. And he said you can't measure inclusive growth. Well, you can actually measure what it isn't, because this week published was a longitudinal educational outcomes from Modern Apprentices report, and it showed that males earned more than women across all occupational groupings, and that difference ranged from £300 to £9,700 of difference. And people from 20% of the least deprived areas earned £4,500 more than those from the 20% most deprived areas. And that's what exclusion looks at, and therefore we should be able to identify inclusive growth and do it. Gender balance on boards, as Richard Leonard said, is a positive step to addressing this, because if you put gender balance on the board, then you will make sure that the workforce reflects that as well. Presiding Officer, we support the development of a national investment bank. However, it needs work to make sure it's built on a solid foundation, and this certainly isn't. We'll use the amendment stage of the bill to amend it in order to create a Scottish National Investment Bank worthy of that name.
Thank you very much. And before I call Mr Halkell-Johnson, I'd like to welcome back Mr Rennie and Mr Neil, who were not present for the beginning of the closing speeches. They're old hands. They know that that's required. Just sit down just now, Mr Halkell-Johnson. And I think no matter how senior you are in here, the rules apply to everybody. So I don't see a note of explanation about why you both came in late. No doubt the notes will appear corroborating each other. I look forward to it. In particular, apologies to Ms Grant for failing to hear the beginning of her speech. I now call you, Mr Halkell-Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm sure the Chamber is unified in our disappointment in those scamps. The legislation around the Scottish National Investment Bank has been long awaited, as Jackie Bailey suggested and Graham Roy of the Fraser of Allender Institute pointed out. Today's bill is about the 8th time that the Scottish Government has tried to establish something of this nature over the last 12 years. The Scottish Conservatives have been consistent in calling for more action to grow the Scottish economy, an economy which has lagged behind the rest of the United Kingdom. And so attempting to improve business support is, in that regard, to be welcomed. Ministers will be aware that there is a good deal of support for many of the aims of this bill, but much of the detail around the delivery of the bank falls out with the direct scope of the legislation. And so we can only hope that the Scottish Government continues to consult and to engage as we move forward. As our convener, Gordon Lyndhurst, mentioned, and as a member of the lead committee, the Economy Committee myself, I feel obliged to highlight the body of work that committee has conducted in this area. In addition to our direct work on the bank, leading, of course, to today's Stage 1 report, we've also touched on many elements of business finance over several inquiries. We've produced work on topics from business support to the role of business gateway, the enterprise bodies, and finally, regional selective assistance as part of our current budget scrutiny. And I would commend a great deal of this work to the Chamber. And it is vital that any consideration of the Scottish National Investment Bank looks at our current framework of business support. We know that there are significant issues around the growth scheme, and our reports have suggested a number of ways in which Scotland's business support landscape should be improved. We can also look at in the examples, both positive and negative, of the Scottish Investment Bank, which was established with similar aims to provide long-term support and investment in the Scottish economy. We do not expect the bank to be a panacea, but it can, with the right organisation and support, be a positive actor in our economy. In my own region, the Highlands and Islands, with our varying local economies and priorities, having the right approach and the right institutions focusing on regional development is vital. Organisations like Highlands and Islands Enterprise have long experience of navigating the business environment there, and it would be a loss if that local institutional knowledge was diluted by the bank's engagement in this area. We've seen examples of a regional focus in the Development Bank of Wales, which has a number of offices around the country. The Scottish Government has rejected this model, and the Cabinet Secretary gave his reasons in evidence to the committee. Derek Mackay spoke of the bank as being the bank that can reach the parts that other banks cannot. Now, clearly, despite his appalling and plagiarised slogan, I accept there are differences in how the two banks will operate. But I'm glad glad the Cabinet Secretary hasn't intervened with a new slogan. But I would ask the Cabinet Secretary to remain open-minded to the need for the Scottish National Investment Bank to ensure that it is open and accessible to, and engaging with all parts of Scotland, even the more remote parts as found in my region. We will work to get this bill right, and the Cabinet Secretary indicated in committee his hope that the parliamentary process would lead to further improvements to the government's proposals. I welcome that approach and hope he honours that. Which leads me to some of the other speeches and ideas from around the Chamber today. My colleague Tom Mason set out both the opportunities and the challenges of creating a new institution. He also spoke of the remit, the objectives and the mission of the bank, areas which will be crucial not only to its success, but to its wider role in Scottish society. He echoed points made on the changing remit of the bank. He questioned how the bank would treat businesses moving towards more environmentally conscious models. And he covered many of the financial elements we've explored in committee. Richard Leonard spoke about the mission of the bank, the makeup of the bank, the board and the like, and while I respect his opinion, I think he's looking to create an idealised but unworkable bank going forward. Jamie Green pointed to the difference that long-term investment priorities will make to the government and the need to look at what success means in the context of the wider economy. He also explored the lessons of previous development funding models, particularly the growth scheme. And he made an important point that availability of credit cannot alone make business thrive while there remain significant gaps in growth and innovation here in Scotland. Any real progress, as we've seen, will depend on the wider business environment. And in that regard, the Scottish Government has much work to do. Alec Neil made a barnstorming speech promoting, I think, global Britain, global Scotland, and opportunities outside of the EU, and garnered a lot of support from these benches, certainly. The opportunities are endless, he said. And, of course, he's right. And Jackie Bailey was also right. She highlighted the important role, as raised as well by Dean Lockhart in an intervention of the UK's financial transactions from the UK Treasury in helping finance the bank going forward. And Dean Lockhart also outlined the need to manage expectations around the bank, that it cannot go too far in yielding to competing ambitions, the original objective of providing patient capital into the Scottish economy. We've heard that there needs to be a clarity of focus, as well as working across agencies and other bodies, both at a Scottish and at a UK level. The risk is, of course, that the bank serves to duplicate work that is currently carried out by other organisations. As Dean Lockhart noted, none of these concerns are new. They were raised in the debate in May last year. However, the problem of managing expectations has grown since this time, with a list of different ills that the bank is supposed to address getting even longer. We've heard some of the evidence in committee around costs. Time and time again, witnesses questioned the assertion that the bank can be self-financing from 2023 to 24. Indeed, there does seem some tension between the desire for patient capital and the hope of quick and easy returns. There are also real concerns about how the provisions of the mission of the bank will impact its operational independence and timescales involved in reporting, with amendments expected at stage 2. It'll be interesting to hear Ministers' responses. Presiding Officer, as has been highlighted today on the Herald website, this is a vital time for the bank to go through. I think it was £135 million of Scottish Government and taxpayer money has been written off to prop up failing companies. So it's vital that we get this right. And we can all agree on the importance of the organisation that exists behind public sector financial support. As this bill moves forward, I hope that the Scottish Government can maintain a clarity of vision around its core objectives. The concept of the bank has potential, and so in that regard, the bill is welcome. And while we have raised a number of issues, very real and valid concerns this afternoon, and the bill will undoubtedly benefit from further scrutiny going forward, it will have our support today. But a willingness to consult must continue beyond the process around this bill, and the Scottish Government must ensure that it works with the committee and other members to make the bank a body which can have a real and positive impact in driving forward investment and improvement in those areas where currently the Scottish economy is underperforming.
Thank you very much, Mr Halford-Johnson. I now call on Derek Mackay to close the Government Cabinet Secretary till 5 o'clock, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and including for that very generous allocation of time, which maybe explains to you why I was trying to intervene on some members earlier. I noticed that you have rebuked some other members of the chamber in terms of their attendance. It was a wee bit lesser of the kind of rebuke we've seen in Westminster of late, and I think the debate we've had in the Scottish Parliament is a very useful contrast right now to show how we're getting on with the day job and trying to deliver the transformational interventions that will support our economy. I actually think it was a very consensual debate. Members were quite right to go through their issues, of course, and I want to respond in that spirit of collaboration and cooperation as we move to stage 2 and stage 3. I'll try and respond to as many and reflect upon as many comments as I can. It is important to say, though, Presiding Officer, that many of these considerations, it might not be for the face of the bill or primary legislation, but can be covered in a range of documents that will be really important to the bank. That will include the missions, the articles of association. Indeed, there will be mission reports, and that's the bank's response to the missions set for it. Of course, there will be a shareholder framework document, a business plan, the investment strategy, the ethical statement, and many members have commented upon the kind of comment or content of that. There will be the annual report on investment performance, and there will, of course, be that independent review of performance as well. So I want to reassure all members that there are many appropriate places to place the kind of direction that Parliament would like to see, but we do need to address the issue. Of course I will, in just a second, but we do need to fully consider the appropriate balance of decision-making that addresses the points being made by many members about accountability, direction and transparency, but also the operational independence that will ensure that this bank is a success.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you to the Cabinet Secretary for taking my intervention. I trust that he enjoyed Alec Neil's pantomime and shared my scepticism about John Mason's crocodile tears about being sadly no longer on the committee when just last week, he said that he had been promoted to another committee. But on a serious point, I think both of those speakers referred to the better organisation in economic terms in relation to national investment banks in European countries. Would he agree that although the SNIB is a good start, we will need to do a lot more, because in Scotland, indeed the UK in wider terms, we're not so good at planning and working these things in as it appears to be in other countries?
A lengthy intervention, but I think we do have time. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'll certainly reflect on that, and I think I will do over the course of my comments, that we are looking at best practice around the world in terms of investment strategies. The National Investment Bank in both scale and intervention. And we have leaned very heavily on the work of Professor Mazzucato, as the convener knows only too well. Mention was also made of artificial intelligence and potential investment in there, and the intelligence within the chamber as well. On occasion, some members of the opposition engage in artificial objections. I would suggest, I'm not referencing Jackie Baillie particularly here, but I'll come back to Jackie Baillie's comments in relation to the investment bank. Let's not lose sight of one really important point, because Jamie Green quite rightly spoke about business support as it exists right now. It is true to say that many businesses actually don't need to wait for, of course, agency support right now, and we should signpost them to the support and the products that are already available. And the government's enterprise family is still attracting investment and new jobs and scale-ups and start-ups in Scotland right now, and many of those interventions are to be welcomed. And the Scottish Investment Bank has been working successfully. But of course, what we want to do here is transformational and at scale. And to touch on the point that a number of members have made, this is about an all-of-Scotland approach as well. So we have a supportive business environment that is bearing fruit, but we want to accelerate that through the Scottish National Investment Bank. And the convener of the Economy Committee, and I'm not getting into the debate about which committee is more important than the other, because I have to attend both Finance Committee and Economy to give evidence. But I think the points from the committee convener are well made, and I hope you appreciate the response to the committee, with more to follow as well. But let's not lose sight that this is the legislation for the bank, and some of the other operational matters will follow in the fullness of time. I will, of course.
Alex Neil.
I'll help him use up his time. Can I point out to the Minister, way back in 1975, when the Scottish Development Agency was formed, it was given a very similar function as the new proposed National Investment Bank. But a number of its early investments, which were high-risk investments, ended up in failure. And as a result of the media and the political reaction to that, it basically closed in on itself and gave up taking any risks. I think one of the points to stress is this bank won't add the value it can and should if it's not prepared to take reasonable risk, because otherwise, if there's no risk, why would other people not invest anyway?
Cabinet Secretary.
I certainly agree with those comments, and of course we would want every investment to be a success, but with that level of risk, then some will not succeed. But it is the right thing to do to set out the missions to transform our economy in a way that responds to the agenda that was set out in terms of the economy, the environment, and of course our desire to have a highly skilled workforce as well. We will focus on more than just the financial returns. That was a key point that Gordon Lyndhurst has made. It will have that mission focus that a number of members have stressed. In terms of Dean Lockhart's point, there'll be more to this than just what is in the legislation. He touched on the running costs, as did other members. Of course, we will refine those operating costs and make sure that Parliament is made aware of them. We'll also look at the entirety of the enterprise landscape to make sure that it's structured in such a way to address any concerns about duplication. The bank should be adding additionality, not substitute finance, and also make sure that traditional banks in Scotland continue to do their job as well. Questions were asked about expanding successful programmes. Of course, we'll try and look at that as well. Richard Leonard, I think, has talked about the scale of ambition for the bank. I think we do have to look about also what's affordable, as well as what we want the bank to achieve. And I think the just transition will be very helpful in advising us, just as Rosanna Cunningham joins me, and what that new economy looks like as well in relation to setting out those missions. A number of members have asked, will I engage fully and give reference to Parliament in relation to the missions? Yes, I will. John Mason asked me about reference around the Articles of Association. Yes, I will engage with that as well. Will I listen to Parliament? Of course I will. Andy Whiteman has asked about the sustainable model and how we grow the green economy, and I think there's much in that, of course, that we should pursue through the National Investment Bank. But I do believe that we have an optimal model to deliver the ambitions for the bank. It will engage further, as I say, on that parliamentary consultation question, and I look forward to the cross-party work that I have committee to. Willie Rennie did raise Brexit. We've tried to focus on what we can do here, but of course Brexit is the main threat to the economy in Scotland right now. But he spoke to the transformational nature of the bank and on the scale and pace of delivery, and then questions around social conditions such as the living wage that I'll give further thought to. Annabel Ewing gave a very thoughtful contribution. Emphasised the strength of patient finance and the approach there, the fact that this is the enabling legislation, levels of investment are important, the importance of the advisory group, the composition of and the purpose of as well. And she quoted this is my own slogan. Jimmy Halcrow-Johnson was worried about me plagiarising other people's slogans. My slogan was that success will look like allowing things to happen which otherwise would not have happened if this financial institution wasn't there. And Annabel Ewing very kindly quoted me on that. Tom Mason covered, I think, a very helpful point around diversification and transition to support those sectors that want to move to that low-carbon agenda, and we should support them through the functions and products of the bank as well, and what difference the bank can make in terms of combining funds and addressing particular need and demand. Alec Neil gave a very powerful speech on the ability to transform the economy if we get this right, and also spoke of the benefits of bringing more companies to Scotland in terms of headquarters and their domestic base, skills and talent. And of course, there's been some big success stories and announcements made already through the economic strategy that we have. Jackie Baillie did raise legitimate questions around the repayment profile of financial transactions. Happy to get back to further detail on that. And reviewing the tools that we have is always an ongoing process to respond to what business and industry actually need as we lead to the operational delivery of the bank itself. And I wouldn't describe the operating costs of the organisation as money lost. If the bank gets it right, it will have a transformational impact on the economy, and that operational cost will be money well spent. I have 1 minute left to go, Jackie, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline you on this occasion. John Mason spoke about not being over-prescriptive in areas such as the committee structure of the bank, but will look for reassurance around the areas that members are interested in. And again, to reinforce the point I made to Jamie Green, if there are companies that want financial support right now, there are many products that currently can be deployed to support our business community to thrive and succeed right now. Pauline McNeill covered housing, absolutely critical. I will welcome the fact that the precursor funds have been used to support housing. I hope that that will continue. Joe McAlpine spoke about the widespread support for this bill and for the bank, which is certainly appreciated, and that's why we want to take it forward. And many members have spoken about the opportunity we have to invest resources to achieve our climate change ambitions that's been discussed recently in Parliament. So this is an ambitious programme. This enabling legislation will allow us to build the bank in a fashion that members have described. I think it's a major intervention, and I look forward to the support across the chamber as we continue to progress it in this cross-party and collaborative fashion to make a success of the Scottish National Investment Bank. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes our debate on Stage 1 of the Scottish National Investment Bank Bill. The next item is consideration of motion 18780 on a financial resolution. And could I call on the Cabinet Secretary to move this motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much. So we turn now to decision time. There are just two questions today. The first question is that motion 19061 in the name of Derek Mackay on the Scottish National Investment Bank Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the final question is that motion 18780 in the name of Derek Mackay on a financial resolution be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.